Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our April webinar. We are so thrilled to have some special guests with us today, and despite the lack of spring weather outside, we are celebrating spring. We are celebrating Donate Life Month. My name is Amanda Farrell. I'm the Director of Donor Recruitment and Experience at ConnectLife. Just a couple of updates and reminders for folks before we invite our guests. For those schools who qualify, those who have had 2 drives with us, our scholarship nomination form is up and live on our website. It is updated for this year with all of the criteria. And advisors, we do need those nominations of your student or students in by May 21st. For those who have not yet scheduled a second drive or are perhaps interested in scheduling another, we do have June dates available for blood drives. And I just wanted to give a special recognition to some of our schools who have some great, exciting things going on this week. Yesterday, we were able to celebrate the life and legacy of one of our advisors' husbands with Sacred Heart hosting a blood drive at our headquarters. MST had a phenomenal blood drive in partnership with Mount Olive Church and their community. They invited in many teachers as well as community and church members, which I think is a great way to show the impact they're having in the community, as well as Buff SEM is celebrating their campaign week this week. We had a great morning webinar yesterday where they practiced how to have conversations with your family about signing the donate registry. So those are just some of our great schools who have exciting things going on this week. Without further ado, I will introduce our guest speakers. We have Aisha Tater and Diane Kalmus with us, representing Donate Life New York State and America's Blood Centers. So I will attempt to share my screen here, and I will bring up, I don't want to create a breakout room. I want to share my screen. And again, for those who do have any questions, I encourage you to type them in the chat. There will be time for Q&A after this, and I will help to moderate that chat. So I'm hoping everyone can see my screen right now. And Aisha, just let me know when you need me to advance slides here.
Will do.
There you go.
Okay, well, thank you. I am delighted to be here. I have always been admired. ConnectLife has had such a productive program in their high schools and their community, and it's been so effective. Such great participation in so many schools joining in the effort to raise awareness of organ, iron, tissue, and blood donation. So delighted to be here. And so we're going to talk today about advocating for organ, iron, tissue donation. And boy, oh boy, is it the right time of year to be talking about that in New York State, because the legislature is in full swing. Okay, next slide, please, Amanda. So just a little bit about me. So Amanda, there's going to be a lot of animations in this one, so just keep clicking. You can click them all, and then I'll go through them. So just a little bit about me, that I went to school I got a master's degree at SUNY Albany. I have a liberal arts degree, and there was a postgraduate fellowship with the New York State Senate. So I applied and was accepted to that program. There's not always a direct path to actually working in the legislature, and the internship in the New York State Assembly and the postgraduate fellowship program in the Senate are really great ways if you're interested in actually working in the New York State legislature. So I'm a big proponent and advocate of both programs. So after my fellowship, because again, it's such a great entree into this professional world, I got a job and became the legislative director for a New York State senator. My job was meeting with constituents and advocacy groups. I researched legislation. Part of my job was reading the paper every day and looking at headlines and trying to see what problems were out there that there was potentially a policy solution. We navigated bills through the legislative process. As the legislative director, I would make sure that the senators' bills got through committee and then to the floor, and then ultimately over to the next house, and then ultimately to the governor's office and signed into law. I was promoted into the position of chief of staff. So that kind of combined both kind of the managerial aspects of a legislative office and the legislative parts and duties. So I would manage the district office staff and the Albany office staff. Then, unfortunately, as sometimes happens in the world of politics, if your elected official, so in New York, the New York State Senators and the New York State Assembly have 2-year terms. And so if your elected official does not get reelected, you lose your job. So after my senator lost the election, I went on to work for a trade association. So I worked for the Northeastern Retail Lumber Association, and I did legislative and regulatory affairs. So then I kind of switched roles from being on the inside and navigating the legislation internally through all the process and listening to the advocate groups. I became one of the advocates that went and spoke to all the lawmakers about issues that were impacting independent building material and suppliers. So then I was there for a little while, and then I went on to be regional director of public affairs for the March of Dimes. So as I was kind of moving into these advocate roles, the geography was getting bigger. So the Lumber Association was regional and did the New England and New York. Then with the March of Dimes, I had half the country. So I'd have everything east of Mississippi, south to Puerto Rico. So it was a lot of travel, and it kept me busy. We didn't have a lot of staff on the ground, so I was going from state to state. All the legislative sessions were different times a year, but it certainly was an exciting job. Then I wanted to take on a little more responsibilities, not just the government affairs aspect or the legislative affairs aspect, and to take on kind of the broader responsibilities of actually running the nonprofit organization. And that's where I am now and today. I'm the executive director of ConnectLife New York State. I say this job it challenges me every day in the best possible way. Next slide, please, Amanda. So about the organization, we're a small statewide nonprofit that's dedicated to increasing organ, eye, and tissue donation. We do that through advocacy, education, promotion, and research. Our goal is to provide a transplant for every New Yorker in need. We're also the operator of the New York State Donate Life Registry, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Next slide. So our members are, ConnectLife, which is one of the 4 organ procurement organizations in New York State, and also the licensed eye and tissue banks. And we include health professionals, community-based organizations, and what I call mission-connected people whose lives have been touched by donation. Next slide. So now let's talk a little bit about advocacy and kind of the process. So advocacy is the act or process of supporting a cause or a proposal. If you are an advocate, you're someone who speaks on behalf of the cause or the proposal. It can be an individual or it can be an organization like mine. Next slide. But most important, the fundamental aspect of advocacy is education. It is the most powerful, and here I took liberties with Nelson Mandela's quote, and I said, it's the most powerful advocacy weapon we can use to change the world. I say my job is not convincing someone that what we are asking for is right, but it's educating them about organ, eye, and tissue donation for them to understand how the proposal is going to have a positive result, and that positive result is saving and healing somebody's life. They need to understand the problem. They need to understand the challenges that New York faces in this space. That's my job, and that's the job of our volunteers and advocates, is to educate the lawmakers about what it's like to be waiting for a transplant, or what it's like to be a donor family and make that decision, so that they can understand. And often the anecdotes and the stories and the content that we share with them about real people and lives is the same stories that they share when they're on the floor of the House or the Senate talking about a particular proposal. Next slide. So these are, this is kind of our process here at ConnectLife New York State, but I'm sure it's very similar to Diane's and everybody else's process. These are kind of the fundamental steps of advocacy. It doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of forethought and strategy. So I'm going to walk you through some of the, the fundamentals. So step one is, like I said, when I was on the inside, when I was working in the Senate, I was identifying problems. Well, you do that whether you're a legislative staff or you're an advocate. You're identifying a problem that needs a policy solution, right? So, and then step two, a very important aspect of the resolution or solution is the research and the data and the evidence. It's making sure that your solution will have the results that the desirable results, or that you can check to see, has another state tried this before? What were the results? Doing your homework, or even in our case, sometimes we're looking at other countries, so it's making sure you understand the problem, and the data related to that problem, and what the potential solution will, the results of that solution. So step three is determining the best path to move the policy forward. So we've talked a lot so far about the legislative path, but you could also solve the problem through an executive order, or perhaps through an executive agency like the Department of Health or the Department of Motor Vehicles. They can do regulations. You don't always have to have new state statutes and law to solve an issue. So step four is developing the strategy, coalition, partnership, identifying, well, who has the shared concern, or who has a shared experience, who may be impacted by this particular topic, who could also join us in the voice in support of this proposal. And then, what kind of campaigns, what kind of events are we going to host? Are we going to do a press conference? Are we going to host an advocacy event? What are going to be the different elements and activities that we are going to be able to communicate both to the public and to the legislature about this proposal and why we need it signed into law? So 5 is, who are identifying your decision makers, right? So who's the gatekeeper? Who's the one who, or more than one? Is it going to be the committee chair? Is it going to be, the leadership of the particular house? Is it the commissioner? So who are the ones who are going to be making the determination on whether or not your policy is going to move to the next step in the process? Then on step 6 is identifying your champion. So while, we have all of the stories and we have the advocates, you really need someone on the inside who can help you in speaking to their colleagues and speaking to leadership about the importance of this proposal. And, unfortunately or fortunately, there's a lot of what I call mission-connected individuals in the legislature who can talk about their own personal experience and why our policy proposals are important. Step 7 is activating. So then we activate and leverage our coalition partners, and we hold legislative education events and advocacy events. We will trigger grassroots campaigns. And then, of course, when all is said and done, when you've gotten this, you've gotten your bill signed into law, or you've gotten your regulation passed, you've got to thank all of the people and all of the groups that helped you get there. Appreciating all of the effort that everybody contributed to the success is a really important part of your building blocks, because you're going to be back. and you're going to want them to help you again. Okay, next slide, Amanda. So what is our issue? You know, what am I conveying? What am I educating lawmakers about? Well, I'm educating them about the organ scarcity crisis in New York. You know, we have a challenge here, and we do not perform as well as other states in this space. So, you know, we have a state registry, the New York State Donate Life Registry. You may recognize the logo there. And unfortunately, our registry ranks 50th out of 52 registries. Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico also have databases that contain all of the individuals in their territory or state that have signed up and given consent to enroll as an organ, eye, and tissue donor. And most of the registries have about 62% of their population. New York, we unfortunately only have 43% of our population. So we have a lot of work to do. Next slide. And, you know, the data is compelling. We have, and unfortunately, this number is going down. When I first started, we had over 10,000 New Yorkers that were waiting for a transplant. We now have around 9,000, but many of them have been waiting, 1,500 of them have been waiting for 5 years or more. And that is that's a difficult life and very challenging life while you're waiting for a transplant. And unfortunately, 600 New Yorkers in 2020 did not get that phone call that an organ had become available to save their life. So that translates to every 15 hours, one New Yorker dies waiting for a transplant. Next slide, please. So the important piece too is that the lawmakers and the public understand that donation works, right? Transplantation saves and heals lives. So what we're trying to do when we're trying to affect change, it's because we know the end result is life-saving and healing. One organ donor can save 8 lives and heal 75 more through tissue and eye donation. Next slide. We also know that our policy solutions work, and that's really important too in terms of our legislative relationships and our advocacy work as Donate Life New York State. Is we've really established quite a bit of credibility. You know, all of the policy items that you see here, we have had to enact state law. So to include the donor designation question or the opportunity to enroll in the registry through voter registration as part of the online DMV process, allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to document this important decision. And I'm sure that's very relevant to you all. Contracting so that Donate Life New York State could get the contract for the registry, incorporating this question in the health insurance exchange marketplace and health insurance, making sure Lauren's Law, a lovely young heart transplant recipient there on the far left there, that requires the question at the DMV be asked. All of these changes have resulted in over 1.3 million registrations. So it works. Next slide. So what are the types of things that we're looking at now? So we have an event coming up next week. I have an issue briefing tomorrow for advocates where we're going to be asking the legislature, and some of you probably recognize Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes there, and we're going to be asking the legislature to help us continue to provide access to the opportunity to enroll as an organ and tissue donor, and doing so by adding the question and the opportunity to enroll in e-tax filings, in the Higher Education Services Corporation applications, and through the mybenefits.ny.gov transactions. So we're hoping to continue to grow the registry by putting this question in more places on a more frequent basis for New Yorkers to sign up. Next slide. So again, I spoke in my little building blocks of advocacy about grassroots lobbying, and that's really what we do a substantial portion of the time is, while we do have a contracted lobbyist, most of the time I'm putting volunteers in connecting them with their elected officials. And so I'm asking them as the public to contact their government official and ask them to support, for example, our Doorways to Donation legislation. Next slide. We do emails, we do, call campaigns, a lot less, and there's also petitions. But mostly what we do is that lovely picture down there is we bring together the volunteers who have those compelling stories, and I schedule appointments and I put them in the offices with the lawmakers and their staff to share their stories, share their experience, what it's like to be waiting for a transplant, what it's like to receive a transplant. And so that's our big grassroots piece. Obviously, that has changed significantly over the past couple of years, but we are going to continue to do that in a virtual setting, just like this one. Next slide. But you all can also, advocate for issues that are important to you. I encourage you all to figure out, who are your elected officials, know who your representatives are. So I've given you some information here on where you can find your New York State Senate representation, your Assembly representation, and you can contact them, whether it's on, ConnectLife or Donate Life, or for blood donation, or some other issue that's really important to you, environmental or public health, or additional topics that are important to you. That's why you reach out to a representative when they have the ability to have influence. If they're taking up a bill or some topic that you have an interest in, it's important to share those opinions with them because they ultimately represent you. You're part of their constituency. Next slide. So again, you can play a really important role. You can play an important role in our space, whether it's organ, eye, tissue, and blood donation, or on another matter that's important to your community. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are doing our advocacy event virtually next week. Instead of, we usually have one day, we're doing it over the course of 5 days. But if you're interested, of course, we'd love to have you. We're having an issue briefing tomorrow so we can talk about some of the legislation in addition to our Doorways legislation. Next slide. And most importantly, this is our wonderful Ruth Bader Ginsburg, fight for the things that you care about, but most importantly, do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much. For so long, anyone who has been involved with ConnectLife has learned a lot about our service lines, a lot about the clinical operations, and we really have not in a number of years focused in on these really important topics. And I think as you all are active in your schools and your communities, it's really important that you understand how ConnectLife fits into the larger picture of the state and also the nation. So just a reminder, you can type in any questions you have on the chat. I will field those later on. So Aisha, thank you so much. And now I will share my screen again, and I will turn it over to Diane for her presentation.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak today. This is something I'm really excited about. I love what I do, and the ability to go and really educate our members of Congress is something that's really fantastic. And blood donation is such an important cause to go and speak to them. Next slide, please. So Aisha talked to you a little bit about kind of that winding path to get to a job. Mine is a lot more windy than hers is. But so who am I and why am I here? So I work for America's Blood Center as the Senior Director of Federal Government Affairs, which is a bunch of gobbledygook, and I'm sure you don't know what that means. So who is ABC? So we represent the independent community-based blood centers. Basically, the nearly 50 blood centers across the United States, basically everybody but the Red Cross, that collect more than 60% of the US blood supply. During COVID, they collected nearly 80% of the convalescent plasma that was used. This is really the majority of our blood supply, and something that making sure everybody is aware of is really important. So that's who ABC is. I'm the Senior Director of Federal Government Affairs. So what does that mean? Well, government affairs means that I organize and work with all of our government partners. So the legislative path that gets talked about a lot, but also working with all of the agencies. And oftentimes we kind of start thinking of just one. So blood centers are regulated by the FDA. There's a lot of work that goes into working with the FDA, making sure they understand what the impact of any changes that they make and the policies that they're working on. Again, this is just a lot of education, but also reaching out to other agencies and organizations within the government, making sure that they know who we are, that we exist, the importance of blood donation. With blood donation, this is really one of those areas where every single agency in the government can be helpful, even if it's by doing something like hosting a blood drive. And so it's a really great opportunity really to work across the entirety of the government. So as I mentioned, my path has been a little more windy than Aisha's has been. So I will just say, never think that you have boxed yourself into a single career. So my undergraduate degree is in mechanical engineering with a specialization in automated system design. And so here I am. And it's just been, if you look back and say, wow, that's a really weird path forward. But the reality is that each time an opportunity came up, I took it. And they didn't always come up through the most logical path. So I went to law school. After law school, I moved to DC. I knew I wanted to do something in this field of government affairs. I wasn't exactly sure what. So I started working for a temp agency, and I ended up getting a posting with a think tank in DC, and that led to a job working in policy for them. I worked on long-term care policy. Funny enough, I started working on transportation policy and discovered that I really enjoyed healthcare policy. From there, I moved over to work for Congressman Kevin Brady. He represents just north of Dallas, Texas, or north of Houston, Texas, about halfway to Dallas. And he was the chairman of the Health Subcommittee on Ways and Means when I started working for him, and was the chairman of Ways and Means when I left. And so it really was kind of winding path. I then moved over to the trade association side, worked for the Rural Health Association first, and now I'm with ABC. So it's a winding path. Anybody who looks back at my experience, people always give me a weird side-eye glance when they see that I have an engineering degree. But the reality is just each time an opportunity came up and sounded interesting, I took it. And so that's the career advice I always give people is, I know it's really easy, you know, when you're sitting in high school. I remember sitting and having this really great path planned out. And I would say there's a lot of similarities between where I ended up, but a lot of big differences. And so just taking those opportunities and recognizing that you can try something and discover that you don't love it, and you can move on to something else, and that's okay too. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that I worked as a Hill staffer. So I worked as a legislative assistant. The titles vary a lot among various congressional offices. It kind of depends. Legislative counsel, you kind of really have to talk to the person and to learn a little bit about what their job is. Also, congressional offices tend to surprisingly be pretty small. And so there's a lot of all hands on deck moments where you're doing all sorts of things. We call them other duties as assigned. And it was always a joke on the Hill is that you ended up with a lot of other duties as assigned. This is often something that a lot of people do, you know, early in their career. They have the time, and, you know, they tend to be very time intensive jobs. And so this tends to be a job that people start taking, and then they can kind of move up, and there's a lot of paths that you can go from there. But congressional staffers, even though they're young, even though they're oftentimes new in their career, this is an opportunity to really, truly make a difference working in those offices. ultimately the member of Congress makes the decisions, but you're the gatekeeper, and what information you provide to your boss and what recommendations you provide and those conversations that you have with that member of Congress. And the one thing that I will say that I get a lot of questions about when people start going up to the Hill and speaking with members of Congress, there's always this intimidation factor. And working in those Hill offices, you realize your member of Congress is a person, just a person. They may be very well educated, not always, and they don't know everything. And so every member of Congress is responsible for every area of policy that the federal government works on. And so while they may be very well versed in one area, they may not be in another area. If you're ever looking for a chuckle at the expense of a member of Congress, I encourage you to go look up Guam tipping over. If you search it on YouTube, there's a lot of videos. A member of Congress seriously asking the question if military placements were going to cause Guam to tip over. And so it is a good reminder that our members of Congress are just people, and they don't know everything either. So staffers, you tend to handle a lot of issues. Again, the member of Congress is responsible for everything that the federal government legislates on. And our office had 3 legislative staffers, so we handled a third of everything that Congress legislated on. And so while you have an area that usually you're very well versed in, I know healthcare, I know Medicare policy, is kind of unreasonable, the level that I know it at. But then there are other areas that I handled policy that I very much did not know. I did agriculture policy. I know a lot about agriculture now, but I didn't know when I started. And I really relied on people coming into the office and helping to educate me. And so that's something I've really always kept with me, is the importance of everybody who comes into the office and really shares their knowledge and experience and how important that is. A major part of this job really is learning from constituents and listening to constituent stories and figuring out how that translates into the work that your boss is doing. So next slide. And I know Aisha touched on this a little bit, but I just cannot emphasize the importance of education and advocacy. Advocacy really is built on the foundation of education, on sharing stories, those personal anecdotes, talking about why you're involved with blood donation, why you're involved in organ and tissue donation. These are all really important areas that so many of us have been touched by, but we just don't think about it. And really translate that into action. So, my mother received a blood transfusion after hemorrhaging in childbirth with my brother. Without that life-saving treatment, I wouldn't be alive today. And so really making those connections and remembering why you're there is important. One of the really great things about my job is that blood is really interesting. When I first started this job, I started doing a lot of get to know you educational meetings on the Hill. And one of the things that I discovered really quickly is that staffers had a lot of questions. We all know kind of the basics of the blood donation and blood, supply issues. But these issues are really interesting. And so once you start talking to somebody, they're usually very interested to learn more. And so that's really an important piece of what we can do, is just reaching out and letting people know. It is important. Aisha laid out how you deal with one issue and kind of build on that and make a plan and build a path to success. And that's really important. But the background of all of that is having a basis of education where all of the members of Congress know your issue and know what it is you do and why you do it and why that's so important. And so this is really kind of the basis of all advocacy, is making sure that you have that base of knowledge and understanding. The blood supply is an essential part of healthcare. And unfortunately, I always say we're the victims of our own success in this area in the blood supply, because the blood supply is just there. We don't really think about it. We don't think about where it comes from. We don't think about all the work that goes into processing those donations and testing those donations and making sure that we have a safe and reliable blood supply, no matter what. This is a perishable product. And so there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that there is enough blood on the shelf, but not too much blood on the shelf. And that's just really important. Another piece of this really is relationship building, making sure that the members of Congress and their staffers know who to contact if they have a question, if something they think they have that little niggle in the back of their head that says, hey, I think this might impact the blood supply. Who do I contact? That's really important. And that was something that we at ABC have really been building out, is making sure that across government, in all sorts of different areas. I am not a labor lawyer. I've had very little labor in my past. But one of the things that we ended up making a lot of really great connections with the Department of Labor, because throughout the course of the pandemic, we had blood centers that had a lot of questions about various labor law issues and how they impacted the blood center. And so it's given us this opportunity to really use and build that base of support. And you just never know when those relationships are going to come in. We all have a voice and information and a piece of the puzzle when it comes to the blood supply. And so this is where I would encourage each of you. Again, your member of Congress is just a person. Their staffers are just people, and they really appreciate the knowledge that you bring and to the table. So reach out to your member of Congress. There's no special magic words that you need to use. You don't have to, sit down with your thesaurus and try to sound smart. They really want the information, and that's really what's important. Next slide, please. So when you go in and you meet with a member of Congress, right now a lot of this is happening electronically, either through Teams meetings like this one, over the phone. You can send an email. It's a really simple process, and it's a really non-threatening process. You can just take the time to introduce the congressional office to the importance of the blood supply. Again, this really is about education. Tell them why this is important. Have a conversation with that staffer and let them know why this is important to you. You have the opportunity to really educate them about the blood center and the role of blood in healthcare and why it's so important. You have stories. Why are you involved? Think back to that and share those stories and really use that to build that bridge. Understanding the blood supply is the most important part. We certainly have asks of our legislator, but the biggest ask is just to make sure that they are aware that the blood supply exists and they're aware of the importance of the blood supply and the role that they can play in encouraging blood donation. And that's a major part of what they can do. Next slide, please. So as important as it is to remember when you're reaching out, it's also really important to have a couple of reminders. Your member of Congress represents you, whether you or your family voted for them or not, whether you agree with them or not, whether they are your party or not. None of that matters once they're your member of Congress. Reach out regardless of party, and recognize that these individuals really are there to try to do good things. And so point out, just move past what party, what letter comes after their name, D or R. This is about you're their constituent and they represent you. I will say this is not a quiz. I know there's a lot of information. Your member of Congress and their staffer may or may not have a lot of that information. So I always say I handled healthcare and know a lot about healthcare, but there's also things that I handled in the way that I handled agriculture. And so there are staffers on the Hill that handle healthcare in the way that I handled agriculture. They learn what they need to when they need to know it. And this is your opportunity to help them learn. Make it conversational, make it enjoyable. I certainly would have some people that would come in and want to quiz me about things. Nobody loves being quizzed on things that they don't know about. So this is really an opportunity to just have a conversation. It's okay not to have all the answers. They may ask you a question, you're like, I have no idea. That's an opportunity either for you to follow up or for you to reach out either to the Blood Center, where you can reach out to ConnectLife, you can reach out to ABC. I'm sure you can reach out to ConnectLife, or you can reach out to Aisha. And we are happy to follow up and answer questions that you may not have the answers to. And again, not everybody on the Hill will have all of the information. Some of them, you are a lot more educated about the blood supply than they are. And so this is just a really great opportunity to share that knowledge. Next slide. This really is about encouraging your member of Congress to build an ongoing relationship with the blood supply, with the blood center. Encourage them to go see a blood center. I know for me, the first time I saw a blood center and saw everything that goes into processing a donation, it was a really, really impactful to see everything that goes into it. You know, we all have, you know, been to a blood drive, you watch the blood leave your body and you think, and then it goes into somebody else's, and you realize how much goes into that process, and everything that's a part of that is really impactful to see all of the work that goes there. Members of Congress can also encourage blood donations. They are leaders in their community. They were elected by their constituency. And so encouraging them to reach out, to schedule a blood drive, to connect blood drives with events that they're working on. There's a lot of opportunities where they can encourage blood donation, including things like encouraging it on their Twitter account or their Facebook account. It can be that simple. This doesn't need to be a huge ask that is difficult. These things can be really simple. So the next slide. So these are our kind of big picture. We have a lot of asks that we take to Capitol Hill every year. And what we do is we kind of put them into 3 categories that really represent kind of a bigger picture item. And so really the first one here is looking at the national importance of the blood supply in emergency preparedness. We've all learned this past year, a little more than a year now, the importance of pandemic preparedness. But the blood supply is important in a lot of disasters, and just making sure that all of our members of Congress are educated and understand the importance of the blood supply and how that interacts. We also want to raise awareness through the pandemic, after the pandemic, of the need for blood donation, especially donors that are younger like yourselves. And then we kind of get into the weeds. We start talking about Zika testing. We talked about having a safe blood supply and the importance of making sure that FDA is really following the science. So next slide. So we work on all of these items, but we can also kind of look back and see what are the items that we've worked on where we can see a really important difference that advocacy has made. And over this past year, we've, collected convalescent plasma. So this is the liquid component of the blood that contains the antibodies that help the body fight disease. And blood centers played an essential role in getting one of the only therapeutics that have been available for COVID-19. And blood centers were very quickly able to mobilize and do this, and it was just amazing. They've collected and distributed more than 500,000 units, and there's still additional units that are being distributed. About a little over 3,000 a week is what we're kind of seeing as usage. So this is still an important part of the fight against COVID-19. This changed along the way. There was a lot of need to work together with our government partners, FDA, on how this was regulated, working with BARDA, who was doing the funding of this, and really building on those relationships. And this is where those past relationships and all of our pre-work. I didn't know when I started this job that there was a pandemic coming. I started 2 years ago, just for reference. I had no idea. And yet we started building relationships. We started meeting with a government agency within HHS called BARDA. We were having monthly meetings with that group. And so at the start of the pandemic, we had relationships. We had established trust, and we had established the ability to kind of speak to each other really candidly. And that was so helpful as we went into this. We had established relationships with FDA as we were looking at regulatory issues that related to this. It was all of that pre-work. We didn't have a specific ask when we went to BARDA and started those monthly meetings. This really was about information sharing and about that relationship building. And so when we did come to a situation where there was a need for us to work together, we had that established relationship, and it really allowed things to move much more smoothly. And so that really is where I have such a strong belief that this really is about the long term. Certainly you have short-term asks, and in the previous slide I showed you ours, but it really is about playing that long game and making sure that our government is aware of the importance of the blood supply. They're educated about how the blood supply works, how blood donors, the donation process works, how the recipients of those donations are able to move on with their lives in a way that they wouldn't have been able to without this life-saving product. And so really building that knowledge and building those relationships is what allows us to do what we do. So next slide. So I'm happy to take any questions. I know we've left a little time for questions. So thank you so much for this opportunity. This has been really fun.
Thank you both so much. You know, both my colleague Sarah at the state level and myself at the federal level, we have both had the opportunity to participate in advocacy days. I can tell you it was extremely informative and interesting for us to be able to participate and advocate as both an OPO and a blood center. You know, and I think it really helps us to be more well-rounded in our overall knowledge and how we can convey to you all. And, you know, on a neighborhood level, on a regional level, and even at a school community level, you all are doing the same things. So, you know, I hope that you all were able to take some nuggets of information from both of these presentations. Again, this webinar recording will be online. If you are interested in learning more, you can always reach out to myself, any of your reps that you work with in the schools, and we can always connect you with both Aisha and Diane should you have any more questions or be interested in learning more. Does anyone have any questions in the chat? All right, so with that, I'll just say thank you again to our special guests. Thank you for the informative presentations and for everyone who was able to attend and who will be watching this in the future. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Amanda. Great job, Diane.
Thank you. Great job,
Bye.
Aisha.